what an honor it is again to deliver God's message to you guys. And this week and over the next couple weeks, we're going to be going through a journey of the kingdom of heaven. Now, I've been wondering about this word heaven. And so let's pause and take a minute to think about heaven. Now, we've all been raised in the church. And so probably the first things that come to mind when you think of heaven is streets of gold, right? A mansion. And in fact, I can remember when I was a kid and the word heaven would come up and my Sunday school teachers would tell me of the great things that heaven would be and that what I could look forward to if I gave my all to Jesus. And that has basically guided me for many, many years. I believe in Jesus because I want to go to heaven. That, for many, many years, that was my North Star. Hey, don't do this because you won't go to heaven. Right? Do this and you get to go to heaven. But I began to think about the word heaven and what Jesus says about heaven. And the series that we're going to go through is going to be looking at Matthew chapter 13. So I would encourage you guys to get ready. We are going to look at several parables about what the kingdom of heaven truly is. Now, parables is a funny word because we don't actually say it in our language too often anymore. But parable is a story. It's a story meant to convey meaning about spiritual truth. However, the parable is not intended for everyone to really understand what the meaning of a parable is. In fact, only a few would really understand what a parable truly was. Another word that we could describe what a parable was or is the word mystery. It's a mystery. And I find it interesting that as I read the parables that Jesus taught, in fact, Jesus taught about 1/3 of all of his writings that we have in the Bible are written in parable form. And I find it interesting that as Jesus taught in parables, there's many times where he never really gave the true meaning of the parable. The parable actually would be something where those who were listening to the parable would either have to seek more knowledge or allow the parable to be answered to them by the Spirit. And so in Matthew chapter 13, we're going to get into some of those parables. And in fact, we pick up the first parables that Jesus talked in Matthew. So Matthew 13 is where we're going to be. To give you an example of a parable, we actually just heard about one of the parables in the parable of the scattering of the seed. Josiah just conveyed to us exactly what the scattering of the seed is. That some fell on rocky soil, some fell on good soil. And the meaning of that is actually in my opinion, it was a little bit basic for the disciples to understand. They could easily identify exactly what this motion is and when seed sprouted and when seed didn't actually make it. And so this was probably a regular occurrence, just like for us, we drive down the street and we see mailmen or people delivering boxes. We may not know exactly how that operates and behind the scenes, but we have a pretty good idea of I push buy on my phone and then a couple days later I get a package. And so, again, we see Amazon trucks, they see people scattering seed and plowing the fields. And so we're going to get into the first parable that Jesus is talking about, the kingdom of heaven. And it's found in Matthew chapter 13. And it's going to be, we're going to jump all the way ahead to Matthew 24. And here's what it says. It says, the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Here's another story Jesus told. The kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who planted good seed in his field. But that night, as the workers slept, his enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat, then slipped away. When the crop began to grow and produce grain, the weeds also grew. The farmer's workers went to him and said, "Sir, the fields where you planted the good seed is full of weeds. Where did this come from?" "An enemy has done this," the farmer exclaimed. "Should we put out the weeds?" they asked. "No," he replied. "You'll uproot the wheat if you do that. Let both grow until the harvest. Then I will tell the harvesters to sort out the weeds, tie them into bundles, and burn them, and to put the wheat in the barn." So this parable comes right after the parable of the scattering of the seed. And it comes at an interesting time in Jesus' ministry because, again, he's probably toward the middle to the beginning of his actual ministry, about a little over 3 years. And because of this, Jesus is starting to get a name for himself. People are starting to see that, oh, well, there's something different about him. And Jesus is now making a stand of who he is. In fact, in a chapter previously, we see that Jesus heals someone on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees don't like that. And so the Pharisees now are at odds with Jesus because Jesus doesn't like what those religious leaders have done to the people. Those religious leaders haven't pointed them to God. They've actually turned some of the people away from God. And so we see that as Jesus is talking about the kingdom of heaven. Now, this isn't the heaven that I talked about when I was thinking about when I was a little kid. The kingdom of heaven wasn't our future. It wasn't necessarily what happens when we die and we go to this great place. The kingdom of heaven was now. It was here. And it says that this farmer went out and planted good seed in his field. But someone came in and sowed bad seed amongst the field. Now, we know who sows negative things on the field. That, of course, is the devil. And we see that as the workers come and they want to pull up this bad seed, and we see that the farmer says, "No, don't do that. Because if you pull up that bad seed, you're going to take the good seed as well. It's better for us to just wait till the harvest comes, and then we'll divide it out at that time." So, of course, we have the farmer. The farmer, we're going to say the farmer is God in this. It does, again, this is not... this is one that's actually explained a little bit later on. So the farmer's God. We have the enemy is going to be the devil. Who is going to be actually working this? That's going to be the workers of God. That's going to be God's people. And so it's interesting, I find in this parable, is that for those who are doing God's work, we have a focus right now of, do we remove people from the church? Do we remove people from those who are sprouting up and who are doing good things just for the sake of being our own? So, for example, I look at the church. I think the closest thing that we have to the kingdom of God right now, we would say the church. Now, the church isn't perfect, of course, but is the church supposed to just be filled with those who are producing wheat? Or is it also going to have those who maybe aren't wheat? Maybe they are sowed by the enemy. See, it's also interesting here is that I can't remember the name of the actual seed planted, but as the seed would grow, it would take time for you to differentiate between the good wheat and the bad wheat. And in fact, it wasn't until about the last couple weeks that when the heads of the wheat would grow, the weeds would grow as well, and that's when you were able to differentiate what was good and what was bad. And so I believe that this is a challenge to us leaders, that we may not be able to tell right away who is good and who is bad. Who is good and maybe someone who has potential. Our goal, our focus here is to preach the Word of God. We also here look at this parable and we know that can the devil destroy God's kingdom before it even comes? Now, for the disciples at this point, that was a key question, because think of how Jesus' ministry started. Very, very small, and started to gain momentum. But the religious leaders at the time were trying to take Jesus out. They didn't want him to cause this revolution. But we see in this that even as the enemy challenges us, even as the enemy plants seeds that is going to try to destroy the crop, the good will prevail. We get to the next parable in the series, and we talk about the parable of the mustard seed. Now, we've heard this parable of the mustard seed. If anybody's seen a mustard seed before, it is one of the smallest seeds that you will find. Here's what it says in verse 34. It says, "Here is another illustration Jesus used. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed planted in a field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but it becomes the largest of garden plants. It grows into a tree, and birds come and make nests in its branches." So again, just as maybe the disciples were hearing, hey, are we going to survive? Is the kingdom of heaven going to be uprooted by the enemy? Jesus gives us confidence that no, the enemy will not win. And then now he talks about the parable of the mustard seed. Something so small that turns into something so big. Now, a normal mustard seed plant would probably turn into more of a bush. They get pretty big, but they don't necessarily get ginormous. Now, what Jesus describes here is something that's abnormal, something very, very large. And that really is what the kingdom of heaven is. Something starting so small, but yet is going to turn into something so great. So great that even the birds are going to come and make nests in its branches. Now, as we close up today's message, a Jew who would hear this story would raise an eyebrow right now, because birds in parables were never a good thing. They were usually thought of as evil. And so again, this is the second time we get a warning about the kingdom of heaven, of how something is going to be so great, but yet there is going to be adversity in the kingdom. Now, I don't believe Jesus tells us these parables to scare us. I think he tells us these parables to encourage us. That when something goes bad and when someone does something wrong, that there is hope. That in the end, God is going to win. I'm hoping that as we go through these parables in the next few weeks, that we are going to see that our God is a loving God of encouragement, who wants to keep us going forward and keep spreading the good news. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for those red letters in the Bible. Thank you for the challenges. Thank you for your love. Lord, as we continue this series on over the next couple of weeks, Lord, help it challenge our hearts and help us see the mysteries of your word. We give you all the praise. Amen.
Okay.